Democracy is a system in which parties lose elections. Political scientist Adam Przeworski gave democracy a definition that makes people uncomfortable. Democracy survives only because those who want power agree, before the votes are cast, to accept the result even when they lose. The moment that bargain phrase, ballots still get counted, institutions still stand, but democracy simply stops working. Welcome to Understandable Insights, Information to Intelligence with Sue Gordon, the national security podcast that gives you a competitive advantage, an elemental understanding of the world as it is, not how you prefer it to be. I'm Eric, joined each week by the Honorable Sue Gordon, and together we'll break down the headlines shaping our world, looking for patterns and early warning signs, and asking how we should be thinking and acting as citizens and leaders across issues in intelligence, technology, and business. It's January 19th, 2026. Let's get to it. Hey, Sue, how are you?
Good, Eric. Big week for me. I will have the last of my 6 weeks of daily radiation this week.
Nice.
I know. And it feels like both forever and a minute. And I will say that for anyone who's been around cancer knows you're glad to be done with the treatment and you know you don't ever get to be done again. So yeah, it's great. And for the people that know, I think one of the greatest consequences of cancer is it steals your innocence. You don't ever get to say, I'm not sure how I feel. And the other thing I'll just say, and we have a long episode today, so I won't do a great job of this, but to Kim, Beth, Karen, Christina, Aaron, Delmed, UT Health, and Texas Oncology, and everyone who brought me to this point, you have my profound gratitude. And to Case and you and Jay and B and my 5 grands and everyone who tolerated me and supported me and just loved me. I hope. All right, carry us forward. I'm such a sap. I'm such a sap.
Well, we're proud of you, and congratulations on getting to this point. That's a lot of work, right? And you put up with a lot.
For all of us, yeah.
Today is Martin Luther King Day as we're recording. I want to recognize that, honor his legacy as we celebrate him today and all that he accomplished and did for our country. But I wanted to ask you, Sue, as one of the more profound and famous orators of a generation, who's one of the best speakers that you've heard in real life?
Oh, and I've been lucky to hear a lot. Just one thing on MLK, we are, as a nation, who we are in part because of him and the profoundness of his action and also his oration. I think the coolest thing about the I Have a Dream speech is that it was not just masterful, but he chose to whom he were speaking, and he chose a lexicon that resonated with them. And weirdly, that's kind of what you and I are trying to do. We're trying to speak in the lexicon, not of the nerds or even from the place of our history, but in a lexicon that matters to the people that have to make decisions. And MLK was brilliant at that. Okay. I've heard some great ones. I heard Colin Powell. He was unbelievable. Jim Mattis. I can't recall the occasion, but it was during these disrupted times. And I remember him saying to some question from the audience that said, how worried should we be? And he said, listen, as long as young women and men continue to come and serve, we'll be all right. And I've held that, and I take great comfort every time you see someone raise their hand, whether it's to serve their turn for their country or just locally, and we'll talk a little about that in elections. But here's the thing that I almost hesitate to say, but I'll say it anyway. One of the best speeches and consequently speakers I ever heard was actually Jim Comey. And I know that's impolitic because he's become so polarizing a figure. But when I heard him speak, and it was back in probably 2015, I thought, oh my gosh, that guy, I could vote for him.
Really?
Yeah. And
did not have him on my bingo card.
I know. And especially with everything that unfolded. And I actually do see error in how he managed his role in the 2016 election, in part because I think he forgot that he personally and his integrity wasn't the point. It's actually the institution. If he had relied more on the strength of the institution rather than believing that he needed to protect the institution, I think we would have been in a slightly better place. But it does remind me that people contain multitudes, but it was inspiring. So who's the most compelling speaker you ever heard besides me?
Present company excluded?
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
I don't know. I don't really have a great answer for that. Many of the ones that came to mind for me were not because of the compelling speech, but because of kind of their history and track record. I heard Kissinger speak once, but it wasn't a great speech. It was just more him and his
Yeah.
legacy. He did shoot down a really stupid question from a midshipman, though, in compelling fashion. It was awesome. So that's still stuck with me.
That's funny that you say that because I thought of Madeleine Albright for the same reason. It wasn't a great speech, but I was awed by her story and the position she's held. Plus, she uttered in my presence the line, "There's a special place in hell for women who don't support women," and I've always remembered that. So like I said, drink in what you get a chance to hear because it can all make a difference to you.
There you go. All right. Now let's get to some
Yeah,
headlines.
now.
So today we'll talk about elections. Looking first at elections as infrastructure. We'll look at an assault on mail-in voting and the conditional strategy tied to these elections. Federal versus state. And finally, how all this plays into the human stress and our resiliency. All right, so we'll start with elections as infrastructure. And elections are symbolic and for many steeped in tradition, but they're also foundational to democracy and a critical infrastructure with attack surfaces. You got cyber, physical, disinformation, funding pipelines, personnel, the list goes on. When the infrastructure is degraded, perceived or real, outcomes become easier to contest and harder to defend. So we have this VoteBeat report. It's the state-federal partnership built after elections were designated critical infrastructure in 2017 is fraying. Election officials describe trust in Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, CISA, as badly damaged, while CISA's hands-on support has narrowed and coordination has become more patchwork. The Associated Press reports that CISA ended roughly $10 million in annual funding to the Center for Internet Security, CIS, affecting services like threat intelligence and incident response. Axios adds that some local officials describe going into election season with less federal guidance and less threat intel, scrambling to build regional back channels and run their own tabletop exercises, while warning that smaller jurisdictions may simply not be able to afford the security posture. Sue, we're about 1 month away from some primaries in some states. What do you think about this reduction in funding and the overall threats to the infrastructure?
Oh, so many thoughts. There are a couple things that make the technical integrity of our infrastructure strong. One is just the distributed nature that it's run by state and local, that it's hard, kind of like with cyber, it's hard to achieve systemic effect in a
Mhm.
distributed system because you just can't figure out the coupling. And I don't think we have any evidence at all of our technical infrastructure being challenged at a level that affects the outcome. And by technical infrastructure, I'm not just talking about any wires or any voting machines, but also just the administrative system by which we run our elections. This was actually the core misunderstanding slash disagreement of the comments about the Russia hoax and
Mhm.
the recent challenging of, oh my gosh, Obama and Brennan and Comey should be indicted because they knew that there was no interference in the election, yet they still did the study. And it all came down to the conclusion that there was not an effective assault on the technical infrastructure. There was intent to influence the outcome of the election. And
Mhm.
that misunderstanding is the one that's promulgated that. So I'm going to assert that our technical integrity of our system is still strong. Even more than that, on the issue of fraud, there's always fraud and we always find it. So just creating this great distrust in our infrastructure, I think, is a strategy more than a reality. Two, the concern that state and local has, I do remember. So I was still in government in 2017, post 2016 election, where we did have indication that adversaries and competitors had tried to access some localities and
Mhm.
particularly the voting records and such. And so we launched this effort to say, hey, we need to get the states together and to make sure that what we know, particularly about cyber threats, can be shared and promulgated. And what we found in 16 was exactly what the vote beat says is not every state has the same resources to be insured.
Right.
And so between 2016 and I will assert 2024, massive work done between the states, the federal government, specifically CISA, and companies that threw their hats in to protect them to really strengthen the connectedness and the infrastructure and to make sure that everyone had access to the best that anyone had. And between 2016 and 2024, the work done by the combined state and federal to strengthen the infrastructure of our systems has been profound, which is what makes what happened in 24 and since in terms of de-emphasizing federal infrastructure writ large and specific that around election infrastructure is disturbing because there are things the federal does for states and localities in terms of bringing resources and awareness and sharing information that's happening in one locality to another one. And as that's been diminished, I think it does introduce vulnerability. Now I'm going to hope that the rest of the system holds up. It is a misunderstanding of exactly how much work was done between 16 and 24 to shore up our systems, especially with the states, and bring it to it. But to your question, is she only enter an election as long as you can be confident in the security? I'm going to assert two things to be true. Number one, there was no outcome changing interference in the 2020 election. And two, you can still have confidence in the technical infrastructure, although over time, without investment in it and with the advent of more and more tools and more awareness and more influence that can happen because of the volumetric aspects of the digital environment, you have to attend to it.
Yeah, we talked before about preventative programs and how they're kind of difficult to measure in the first place. And the Vote Beat article did a really good job of highlighting some of the states, like you said, are really well off or they've done a lot of work on their own. Georgia specifically, they
Yep.
highlighted as being really well prepared. But when you take away these resources from other locations and other localities that otherwise don't have the resources to raise themselves up, you may not see as much of a
Right.
fall off here, but this is long-term and downstream effects. We might not see it in the 2026 midterms, but this reduces the resiliency over the long haul, 28 and subsequent.
So you're going to hear my bias that I always think first about adversaries and competitors that would want to do us harm by
Mhm.
undermining our confidence in our most sacred element of democracy, which is voting. Probably since, I'm going to say 2010, I've been saying this word, what does massing at the border look like in cyberspace? What is the observable of that? And one of that is, can you correlate what happens digitally in one place at speed with other things going on so you can see a broader trend? And so I think one of the other things that happens when you don't have any lattice work that connects this really wonderfully distributed system that we have, I think that you lose some of the warning signals. That which appears unique and random in one locality is actually part of a larger pattern.
So we've highlighted CISA here specifically from cybersecurity, and you kind of think of that as almost one of the worst case scenarios of somebody in the ones and zeros hacking into the
Yep,
election computer and then changing a vote from one candidate to the other to affect an outcome. Infrastructure is considerably broader than
yep,
that. It covers everything from
yep.
the amount of locations you have, the people supporting it, and we'll talk about the human aspect later. So, what do you think about some of the other areas of the infrastructure aside just the cybersecurity?
Almost all of the cybersecurity attacks almost or never someone penetrating the
Right.
system itself. It's always human enabled, right? They get to some insider who gives them access to something. So you're absolutely right. It's not generally just a technical attack on a system. Democracies work because people choose to participate in them, right? And so most of the rest of our infrastructure is because humans decide that they are going to either participate, I believe in it, so it's going to happen, and assure. Because it's
Yep.
important to the people around me, I'm going to make sure that it's true. And so I think my biggest worry is a lot of undermining of confidence. And then the ripple effect of that is that people who believe that they have to have a particular view on that will either underinvest in the administrative infrastructure
Mhm.
or the humans themselves will decide, I don't want to be part of that or I don't want to bear the consequence of that. The second, much greater risk is really on the elements of participation by
Yeah,
humans and the investment by humans, whether in time and dollars, to make sure that their piece of it is well served.
for sure. And we'll transition into the other part of the infrastructure here. The Supreme Court ruled last week on January 14th in Bost v. Illinois State Board of Elections that political candidates have the legal standing to challenge election laws before voting or counting starts. Representative Bost wanted to challenge an Illinois law that allowed election officials to count mail-in ballots that arrived up to 2 weeks after Election Day, as long as they're postmarked on time. I lean more towards concurring with Chief Justice Roberts, I think, and the 6 other members of the court, that so long as this is resolved prior to the actual election day, that it's just setting the ground rules. However, opponents like Wendy Weiser and the Brennan Center for Justice warn that allowing candidates to challenge laws without proving harm first could also create an influx of frivolous lawsuits. She said, quote, "At a time of conspiracy theories and stress on elections, SCOTUS just opened the floodgates to candidates challenging election rules." Sue, what say you?
Noise in the system that can't be resolved is deleterious to confidence in elections. And so I think, as with so many things right now, I don't disagree with the intent of the ruling. Our laws are meant to be challenged. People have the right to question things
Mm.
and be heard on that. What ultimately the Supreme Court was about is someone without standing can make a claim. And I wish that our democracy has been modernized enough for the fast, digital, information abundant world that we have. But you are flooding a fundamentally manual system with anyone who wants to make claim who can disrupt it. That impedance mismatch between the signal that you're allowing to be introduced and the ability to resolve that signal, even if you're saying it has to be beforehand, I think there are signs that there is a faction of people, and let's take personality out of it, people in power, using power to keep power is always a worry. And so I think the signals that are coming out of this administration vis-a-vis this issue that are already challenging legitimacy. So I don't mind the intent, but realistically, I think I see the effect. I don't think people need to go high right on this decision because you said it so eloquently. This is kind of fundamental to who we are. People with grievance have a chance to have it heard. But I
Yeah.
think realistically, oof, you've got an impedance mismatch between what you've now allowed and what you can resolve. And then the effect of that disquiet is lack of confidence.
We've talked about the volumetric effect, right? There's only
Right.
one Supreme Court, and it reminded me of all the executive orders. You can throw all these things out there, and it's going to take time for them to get adjudicated and resolved. There's just the volumetric effect of them going through the system.
Yeah, as an aside, and we won't talk about it today, I do think democracy, particularly that which is practiced by us, is a really good system. I do think it needs to be modernized. Digital world, and you know this as well as I do. You can't always automate a manual process and get the outcome that you need, and I think that's what we're trying to do. So we'll talk about that in one episode,
Yep.
how you modernize democracy.
Well, I jumped a little ahead. Mail-in ballots have been central to this doubt argument. In August, President Trump had a truth on Truth Social about barring mail-in ballots and potentially some voting machines, later stating that, quote, "We're going to start with an executive order that's being written right now by the best lawyers in the country to end mail-in ballots because they're corrupt." They probably ran into some issues there, because we haven't heard much about that since August. But the Brookings Institute also provides some evidence side counterweight about how mail in ballots are actually not that corrupt. Mail in voting has very low fraud rates and meaningful voter access benefits, which underscores the gap between empirical risk and political narratives built to delegitimize certain methods. I've voted absentee many times before, both stateside and abroad. If the data says a method is safe, like mail in voted, why is it still so effective to cast it as illegitimate, Sue?
See episode 26 of Understandable Insights
Yeah.
and put it on repeat. This is a strategy to basically convince people that they can only trust the voice that they believe in and anything else, no matter how supported by data. And so I haven't seen any data to support the claims of either massive fraud in the 2020 election, that mRNA is bad, that COVID vaccines didn't work, that you only need 11 vaccines, or that mail-in voting is bad. There just isn't data to support any of those things, and yet there's a constant drumbeat of challenge of that, and our loss of trust in our institutions and our expertise is really creating an untenable situation. Can we just talk, though, about the idea of an executive order with the President of the United States saying that he can assert? Really, the Constitution on this is so clear, right? There's Article 1, Section 4 that says the times, places, and manner of holding elections for senators and representatives shall be prescribed by each state. And then the
Mm.
10th Amendment is a reinforcing preamble. The powers not delegated to the U.S. by the Constitution are prohibited by the states, and they're reserved for the states respectively or to the people. Said bottom line is that the federal government is not operational, does not have operational control over elections. But again, if you add to this question of whether you should believe it, whether those guys are good, whether the Constitution meant the words that it actually said, I think you are just kind of fomenting discontent. And with discontent comes lack of belief. And with lack of belief becomes lack of participation, and lack of participation becomes the end of democracy.
Bill of Rights, QED.
Yeah.
Maybe they are the best lawyers because they haven't come up with anything here. So
Huh,
they
right.
it's kind of gone away. Continuing on this conditional acceptance becomes a multi-pronged approach, pressuring officials and reshaping administrative capacity. One example the Associated Press had was a story on Heather Honey's appointment as the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Election Integrity in the Office of Strategy, Policy, and Plans. This happened back in October 2025, but apparently she was a corporate investigator who, after the 2020 election, joined forces with Cleta Mitchell, an attorney who had worked for Trump. She played a central role in the Maricopa County audit that Republicans in Arizona did after 2020 election. Anyway, she now has a platform in front of the secretaries of states, so limited actual authority, but this is an example of a platform, and putting election fraud claim promoters in roles that touch integrity can transform doubt from an outside talking point into an inside posture. So, Sue, what do you think about this lady being in this position?
The intellectual dishonesty between a previous administration putting in position that's about looking at the integrity of information, saying that was controlling free speech, but now this, a federal position that is challenging the way we've done elections, is somehow the right way to do it, just makes my head explode. It is potentially all overreach, even though there are some foundations that need to be explored. So, I don't like this. I don't like the way it's being manifest. I don't like the way it contributes to the other things that we're going to talk about that are going on with elections, and this whole notion of creating uncertainty around whether you can accept the outcome, which is apropos of your quotation. In 2020, even though it was just such an awful time around that election, we just didn't know what was going to happen. There were things that I was really, really proud of. I was proud of how many Americans voted, right? We had been
Yeah.
inundated with it's going to be unfair, it's unfair, it's unfair, it doesn't have integrity, and yet more Americans than ever turned out to vote. And to me, that was number one. Do Americans still turn out to vote? And you mentioned this a couple times, and that if people show up, are we going to be okay? And then the second was that the secretaries of state, political appointees that had a political affiliation, when pressed, did their jobs. My worry is that there has been so much maneuvering politically, whether that is who wins elections, who's supported, all the way up to gerrymandering,
Yep.
that most fundamental thing. And again, think about that. Regardless of political position, do the people that hold jobs do their job? I think that's one of the kind of last bastions of the success of our system.
Mhm.
It's why I hate the assault on the professional cadre in the federal government, good, bad, or indifferent. The truth is they do their jobs. Whether that job is always well done, who knows, but they do their jobs. And these state officials did their jobs. And I worry that both the participation of the populace and the will of elected officials, regardless of party, are also under assault. And whether this new position is a way to put pressure on them, I think time will tell. And I think one of the things we're trying to do is to put a counter narrative out there that says, have your eyes open and judge what you see and care about who gets into positions of power.
Yeah. This one for me kind of borderlines on putting on my tinfoil hat, like the lady getting in here and having that much of a say because she doesn't have much actual authority. It comes down to the states, and we'll talk more about the states here next. But it does remind me of just desensitizing. If you hear
Mhm.
this narrative over and over again, it's hard to maintain because you're flooded with information and everything you consume helps impact your decision making.
Well, you said it. I would opine that half of America believes that mail in voting is the mechanism for fraud, even though there's no data to suggest that.
Half?
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
Or the most likely avenue for
right.
fraud.
Just as a lot of Americans believe that the 2020 election was stolen when it was not, right? So
Yeah.
the problem is we still like authority. We want to trust people in positions of authority. And so when they're saying something over and over again, if in this hyperpartisan world, if there's someone who comports with your belief or you don't demand of them evidence, you accept what they say. I don't know. I
Yeah.
worry.
But the good news is the states, like you talked about,
Yep.
decentralized by design. The fight, though, is no longer who won, it's who gets to define what winning means. So, in May of last year, the Justice Department began demanding copies of states' voters' registration databases, including sensitive information such as driver's license numbers and last four digits of voter security numbers. It has been publicly reported that the DOJ has requested information or meetings about election administration from at least 33 states, and it's asked at least 27 of those states for copies of their voter registration lists. The Brennan Center, again, is using public records to track those DOJ requests, and a few states have sent their DOJ their voting files, but those that did, at least 11, seem to have provided only the publicly available versions of their voter files. The National Council of State Legislatures, NCSL, advocates that as federal support and posture shift, states are adapting. They're trying to close the gaps, coordinate differently, and reassert their role in running these elections. So, Sue, why did DOJ need this data? Was it curiosity, requests for new gerrymandering maps, or the more sinister, turning voter files into leverage in a wider struggle over election administration and narrative control? Or D, none of the above?
Boy, you know how much I want to believe in our institutions. I do. It is the hardest thing for me to give up on, but this just isn't a DOJ role to initiate. If states are worried and they request DOJ support because DOJ resources are more abundant, that's one thing, but this isn't. It feels like federal overreach, and I really have been worried since 9/11 about the escalation of government privilege, and this feels like one of them. I don't like it, particularly because technology now allows us to do things with massive amounts of data. And as an intelligence officer, I can tell you that you can find patterns where there are none. So I don't see any imperative. I don't like DOJ initiating it. I like the idea of the federal being supportive of states with elections. Yes, they can start doing interesting things. I mean, just that President Trump made no bones about telling states what he wanted to have happen in terms of representation suggests to you intent that is not benign. Now, he may assert legitimacy because he won the election, but still, we know
Mm,
the intent. There's an analog here back. I mentioned the 2017 intelligence community assessment on Russian attempts to influence the 2016 election. And again, they didn't interfere with the technical infrastructure. They did, however, try influence. And this is a very influency move. if you and I both put on tinfoil hats, which is always bad for our listeners if we're both wearing them, and you say, no, no, they want that data so they can launch influence campaigns to send messaging specific, more tuned to individuals that sounds, because of what they know, more legitimate. Boy, you can get there. But I'd start at the more simple. It might just be overreach. I don't think there's anything that says that this is something the federal government needs to involve itself in. And so we should avoid that escalation of privilege. What worries me most about election interference by anybody to influence elections, I worry far less about corruption of the technical infrastructure and much more that you'll have a targeted message sent to a set of people saying, go here or go there, or don't do this or don't do that, or sending information to a targeted set of people that when they receive it, they're like, oh my gosh, it would be bad if I voted. The more data you collect, it is a tool that people who want to influence can use. So I don't like it. And the government having all data, access to all, as opposed to that which they can get a warrant to collect on an individual. I say again, we're revolutionary people. We don't like that. I don't
Yeah,
care who's in power. We don't like it. I don't care which party has it. I don't like it.
right. But all these stories and all these add to human stress and degrade the human component. The front line is the administrators, the poll workers, local officials, who are often just patriotic volunteers, and voters operating under this pressure and scrutiny and sometimes direct threats. When people inside the system get exhausted, underfunded, or delegitimized, it becomes much easier for bad faith actors to argue the whole enterprise is conditional. VoteBeat again had an article that captures what we already know. Officials describe a mix of practical stressors, tight resources, shifting guidance, process uncertainty, and the psychological reality of operating in a high suspicion environment where every routine decision can become a national controversy. And then also, Princeton University did some research following the 2024 election that tracked harassment and threats into incidents directed at election officials, showing examples of this intimidation. Between January 2022 and November 2024, BDI recorded approximately 170 election-related incidents of threats and/or harassment targeting local officials around the country. Election officials and poll workers specifically were targeted in most of these events, approximately 140, with over 35 additional events targeting other local officials like judges. So, Sue, how do we help the people?
Okay, so let's start with my Jim Mattis quotation, and that is, as long as good people choose to serve, we're going to be okay. I have two experiences that give me great confidence. One was the 2024 election that I voted in for the first time in Cold Spring, Texas. And standing in line there in this really summer heat, I have no idea who I was standing in line with in terms of their proclivities, but I do know there were a set of election workers that were working so hard to make sure that the system worked, that everything was done properly, that when someone's name didn't show up, they worked with them to figure it out. So teeny tiny town of 893 election workers that were proud of it and did it. So number one, people are still serving. And then I have a former teammate and dearest friend from Duke who, upon her retirement, decided how she was going to serve was she serves as an election official. One, her investment of time in doing this, the number of classes she has to go, how long she prepares, and her confidence in the system and her pride in the system tells me that the need to serve and the imperative behind service is actually much stickier and more profound than the desire to disrupt. So I think one is that people still want to do good and want to do good for their communities and for their country, and so we hold on that. I do think our elected representatives, and I feel this on every front, have kind of forgotten that one of the things that they're supposed to do for their populace is to create calm, give them confidence, and give them hope. And I think there needs to be more messaging around them and more actually prosecution of the people that commit crimes against not just our systems, but our individuals. There's a leadership gap here right now in terms of people sending out the messaging that say, stop it,
Hmm.
stop this. But I will say the strength of the system is in the people who want to serve and believe. And I think my evidence is that's still strong. Now, whether it will hold, under the assault that just the environment and some individuals are doing? I don't know. My bottom line is the human element is both the weakest and strongest element of our system. And so far, the strength has helped.
Yeah. Do you think that the next big election cycle being midterms, that it's states electing representatives at the federal level instead of a conglomerate of federal voting for a national election, is that going to inspire more trust and more legitimacy?
We're trying to talk a little bit more about precedent and signals. I think we have a great opportunity with this midterm election to do some watching to see which way it's going to go. I think there are, lots of noise. Let's see whether there's some signals. And I think there are indicators of democratic health that we're trying to talk about that few others do. One, are we seeing a language shift, right? We lost is one thing. And the system can tolerate anger over losing versus the system is illegitimate. The former, we lost, keeps the door open. The latter tends to close it, even if no action follows immediately. So let's watch for, in this midterm, whether we're seeing that continued language shift from we lost to the system is illegitimate. The second is institutional targeting, who's blamed. If there are errors or there are things that go wrong, are they specific enough to be correctable, or do we cite entire institutions in a move to kind of delegitimize the process in general? So if the target shifts
Mhm.
from decisions to the institution itself, whether it's courts or whether it's states, watch that. And then finally is what comes out of the midterm, because the most dangerous signal, of course, isn't protest, it's withdrawal. Do we see evidence of refusal to certify, refusal to participate in future processes, calls for boycotts? Yes, there will be the results of the midterms that we see and the consequences for that in terms of policies and actions that issue forth as a result of who we choose to send to represent us. But I also think this is more than a canary in the coal mine. This is a dog at our back door, and we ought to be watching for some of those signals.
One thing I want to teach my boys is to be as respectful in defeat as they are in victory. And so a lot of that comes down to our candidates who lose, because if you do lose an election, okay, what did we do wrong? This is the will of the American people. This is what the voters decided. And then what should our party do differently to better address those issues in the next election? Or how can we best serve the American people? Because it's not about you. You've said this before. You're filling this institution, you're filling this office, and you're only renting it because you said that you'd be able to do the best job and the people believed you. If you lost, then how do you prepare yourself to fill that role next time?
Yeah, that's much more eloquent of losing leaves the door open. Just because you lost, the door is open for what you do next time. Interesting enough, Pazorski has another quotation that's democracy is not the law of the majority, but the protection of the minority, especially the minority that just lost. So I think teaching your boys and for everyone, winning with respect and losing with dignity are like super important to our democracy. You think that it's just a moralistic view of how to be a good person, but I think for democracy, it's really important. So good on you for teaching the boys.
So one of the things that we wanted to do, and we advertised this earlier this year, was suggest some questions for our candidates as we approach the midterms and beyond. So with respect to election security and what we've talked about today, what questions are you asking of your candidates as you go to the booth in November?
I think mine is for everyone out there, are you, and you ought to ask this of your representatives, prepared to accept the results of the election, even if your candidate loses? And you can ask that of your candidate, but I think you ought to start with asking yourself. If you believe us that the fact that elections are binding is much more important than that they produce the right result. How about you?
Yeah, I like it. Are you willing to accept the results? And I expect you'll get a lot of, well, if the conditions are set and well, if we can validate. You need to have that established before you go in, much like my position on the Supreme Court ruling of as long as it's established before you go in, then we know the rules of the game before we play them. You're
Right.
not changing the rules in the middle of the football game or at halftime. No, that's how you have repeatable,
Yeah.
transparent, and fair, right? Is by knowing the
Yep.
rules and keeping them consistent and changing them at a pre-designated time outside of the
Yep.
election cycle.
All right, we're on our way.
Yep. So what are you watching?
So it's hard for me not to be watching Greenland and Minnesota. I think these are alligators really close to our boat. I'm going to try and not to be breathless about it, but I am worried about each because it feels like we're starting fires that can burn out of control. So Greenland and Minnesota, for the reasons that we said last time. And just, Eric, if you'll give me one moment of personal privilege on Minnesota. I really don't care what side of the line you fall on with respect to immigration ideology or the line between respect for the law and the right to protest. I mean, those are real tensions. Those are real tensions. But the lack of leadership shown by the people in power in this moment is even more stunning than it is unsurprising. Seriously, this is a massive leadership failure. Power carries responsibility. No one can be watching what's happening in Minnesota and think that continuing to hold the way you're doing it is going to work. As a leader and someone who loved leading and has made leadership mistakes and been willing to accept the consequence, come on. Nothing about this is the way it can continue. And people in power are the ones that have the responsibility to find a new way.
For me, similar to the Greenland, watching the World Economic Forum in Davos kicks off today, Monday the 19th. So I'm sure there'll be more talk of Greenland. Also, kind of funny that in response to some of these threats of the U.S. taking over Greenland, that these NATO allies sent troops to Greenland. France sent 13 people that were already on a training exercise, and Germany sent like 14. Like those numbers were strikingly small, but it's symbolic more than anything else. It was just funny. And maybe they couldn't find any volunteers to go in the wintertime.
No, it's a real dance that everyone's doing right now because the reality is there is real power and real ability the United States has. And so even as you're trying to project strength and countering that position, I think they're probably also trying to not make the situation worse.
For sure.
Although it is funny.
13 guys and ladies probably too. I don't know. Also watching if Machado takes a larger role in the Venezuela piece and moving forward after she gave her Nobel Prize or Nobel Medal. Well, I think imagine she's keeping the $1 million, but giving her Nobel to President Trump last week.
Yeah, I say no. And the reason I say no is, or I'll say only if the president comes to believe that she offers him some advantage. I'm not a big fan of what she did with her prize. However, I wish I had remembered the speech I heard her give from hiding in the acceptance of a McCain Center award, which was breathtaking, inspiring, and reason why she holds the position of reverence with at least the people that countered the regime. So I'm not a fan of her action, but I may be a fan of hers.
And then last thing I'm watching is the Winter Olympics are less than 3 weeks away. We'll talk about in subsequent episodes your favorite Olympic sport and some Winter Olympic memories.
I know.
But just surprised me the other day when I saw an ad for it. I was like, whoa, it's almost here. Let's go.
Yeah. Yes. You think I care about Duke basketball. I love the Olympics. I do. Yeah. We're going to have to keep ourselves controlled on this front.
Not digress into
yeah, I know.
It's only a couple weeks, so that would only affect like 2 episodes, I suppose.
Okay, so I'm gonna give a demographic test to our listeners. I think one of my most iconic Winter Olympic moments was Franz Klammer in the downhill. Look it up.
All right. We'll come back and talk about it next week because that's what we're watching and how we see it. Thank you for joining us, and no doubt there's more to come. This country's strength isn't in its power, industry, or government, but in its people.
So thanks for joining us, and we still love to hear what you think. You all have been reacting to the listener guides that we put out. Keep the cards and letters coming. We try and get better each one. So join us each week and go forth, do good, and for goodness sakes, be kind to one another because it really does make a difference.